This is the fifth part of the lecture on central nervous system. Let's see about the cross-section of the spinal cord. The spinal cord consists of a superficial white portion and a deep gray portion. And the white matter consists of myelinated axons. They form nerve tracts in spinal cord. And the gray matter consists of neuronal cell bodies and dendrites. We may consider about the cross-section of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is divided into two halves by two deep clefts or grooves. Those are anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus. You can see the anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus in the images below. The white matter in each half of the spinal cord is organized into three columns. They are called ventral column, dorsal column, and lateral column. Each of these columns of the spinal cord is subdivided into tracts. These tracts are also called as fasciculi or pathways. So in this image you can see the columns arranged in the white matter of the spinal cord as the dorsal column, ventral column, and the lateral column. A collection of axons inside the central nervous system is called a tract. But outside the central nervous system, a collection of axons is called a nerve. These tracts have different myelination than nerves, and also they do not have the connective tissues like in nerves. These individual axons ascending to the brain or descending from the brain usually group together to form these tracts. In this image you can see how these tracts are arranged in white matter of the spinal cord. And the ascending tracts are shown in red color while the descending tracts are shown in green color. When we are considering the central gray matter of the spinal cord, it is organized into horns. Each half of the central gray matter of the spinal cord consists of a thin posterior horn and a larger anterior horn. In some levels you can see some small lateral horns also. In these images you can see how this central gray matter is arranged into horns. Posterior horn, anterior horn, and the lateral horn are there. The two halves of the spinal cord are connected by gray and white commissures. The gray commissure is a transverse bridge of gray matter which connects the anterior and posterior gray horns on each side. This gray commissure is pierced by the central canal, and it is divided into anterior and posterior parts. The white commissure lies ventral to the gray commissure. It mainly contains nerve fibers. You can see the white commissure and the gray commissure in this picture. The gray and white commissures contain axons that cross from one side of the spinal cord to the other side. And the central canal, which is located in the center of the gray commissure, helps to circulate cerebrospinal fluid, which is associated with the ventricular system of the brain. The spinal nerves arise from dorsal and ventral surfaces of the spinal cord. These nerves arise from rootlets which are located along the spinal cord. 6 to 8 of these rootlets combine to form a ventral root on the ventral side of the spinal cord. In the same manner, another 6 or 8 form a dorsal root on the dorsal side of the cord at each segment. Here you can see how the rootlets arise from the ventral and the dorsal surfaces of the spinal cord, and then they get together form the ventral root and the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. Then this dorsal root and the ventral root combine to form the spinal nerve. The ventral and the dorsal roots extend laterally from the spinal cord, and then they pass through the subarachnoid space, piercing the arachnoid matter and dura mater. Then they join one another to form a spinal nerve. Each dorsal root contains a ganglion, which is called the dorsal root ganglion or spinal ganglion. Here you can see again how these rootlets arise from the surfaces of the spinal cord and how they get combined to form the dorsal and the ventral root, and how the dorsal root and the ventral root combine with each other to form a spinal nerve. And there in the dorsal root there is a dorsal root ganglion. The axons of the sensory neurons, which comes from various parts of the body, passes through the dorsal roots of the spinal nerves. So, the cell bodies of these neurons form the dorsal root ganglia. In this picture, you can see how the axons of sensory neurons comes through the spinal nerve and then enter the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, and then the cell bodies of those neurons form dorsal root ganglion. These axons do not make synapses in the dorsal root ganglion. They just pass through the dorsal root into the posterior horn of the spinal cord gray matter. There, these axons either synapse with interneurons in the posterior horn, or they just pass into the white matter and ascend or descend through the spinal cord. So in this image you can see how these sensory neurons form synapses with the interneurons in the dorsal horn of the gray matter. As we know, motor neurons innervate muscles and glands. The motor neurons starts from the gray matter of the spinal cord. The cell bodies of the motor neurons are located in the anterior and lateral horns of the spinal cord gray matter. You can see them in the image below. And the axons of these motor neurons runs along the ventral root of the spinal nerve. This image will give you a summary on terminology we learned during this lecture. What are the functions of the spinal cord? It has two main functions. The first one is it conveys impulses or messages between the peripheral tissues and the brain. And it also provides integrating center for the spinal reflexes. Now we are going to learn about reflexes. When we are considering the nervous system, the basic structural unit of the nervous system is the neuron. But the basic functional unit of the nervous system is the reflex arc. The reflex arc is the smallest and simplest portion of the nervous system which is capable of receiving a stimulus and producing a response. This is a reflex arc. The reflex arc generally have five basic components: a sensory receptor, a sensory neuron, an interneuron, a motor neuron, and an effector organ. The simplest reflex arc do not involve interneurons. So these are the components of reflex arc: the receptor, sensory neuron, integration center or interneuron, motor neuron, and the effector. A reflex is an autonomic response to a stimulus produced by a reflex arc. It occurs without conscious thought. Action potentials initiated in sensory receptors are transmitted along the axons of sensory neurons to the central nervous system. There, the axons usually synapse with interneurons. Here, the touch of the pin is the stimulus, and the sensory receptors are behind the skin. So, when they get the stimulus, that impulse goes through the sensory neuron to the central nervous system. They are in the spinal cord or in the brain. The sensory neuron synapses with the interneuron, and then impulse passes to the interneuron. These interneurons synapse with motor neurons, and the motor neurons send their axons out of the spinal cord, and then they go through the peripheral nervous system in order to reach muscles or glands. The action potentials or the impulses which goes through these motor neurons can cause these effector organs, the muscles or glands, to make a response. This picture gives you an idea how reflex arc is working. Individual reflexes vary in complexity. That means they have different complex individual reflexes. One type is monosynaptic reflexes. It involves simple neuronal pathways in which sensory neurons directly synapse with motor neurons. The other type is polysynaptic reflexes. They involve more complex pathways and integrative centers. They have one or more interneurons between the sensory and motor neurons. Many reflexes are integrated within the spinal cord, and the others are integrated within the brain. Some reflexes involve excitatory neurons. They result in a response, for example, muscle contraction. Other reflexes involve inhibitory neurons, and they result in inhibition of a response, for example, muscle relaxation. The higher brain centers can influence the function of reflexes, that is, through suppressing them or exaggerating them. So this is the end of the lecture on central nervous system.